Stockholm is famous for a lot of things. You may have heard about the beautiful nature or the architecture, or maybe you've heard about the Viking history around Stockholm. But I think there's one thing in particular that people have heard about: the Stockholm Syndrome. And I'm not talking about a song by Muse or One Direction. I mean the interesting one, the psychological condition. Today we're gonna learn more than we ever wanted to know about the Stockholm Syndrome. The way the Stockholm Syndrome expresses itself can be pretty dramatic. Captives can start to defend their captors, and even try to help them achieve their goals or escape the police. The syndrome came into the spotlight in 1974 with a woman named Patty Hearst who was kidnapped. She actually ended up joining her captors in performing a robbery. Her defense lawyer claimed that she had been brainwashed and suffered from Stockholm Syndrome. Another more recent example is Natasha Kamphurst, who was kidnapped as a small girl in 1998. She was held in captivity for 8 years, and apparently she cried when she heard that her captor had died, and she lit a candle for him. But before we go deeper into the syndrome, let's go back into ancient history to 1973, where it all started. On August 23rd, a man called Janne Olsson walked into a bank that used to be located inside this building in central Stockholm. He fired off several rounds with a submachine gun and took 3 women hostage. The police were alerted, and 1 officer was injured in the brief shootout that occurred. Janne Olsson demanded that a notorious criminal called Clark, who was in jail at the time, should be brought to the bank. And he also demanded 3 million Swedish crowns. That's equivalent to 20 million today, and that's roughly $2.5 million US. Clark was brought to the bank, and he and Janne took shelter in the bank safe. After a siege that lasted 6 days, the situation was resolved when the police managed to drill holes into the bank safe and sedate Clark and Janne with gas. So after some complications, the hostages were freed and the bad guys were caught. It sounds a bit like a Hollywood movie, doesn't it? Well, let's get into the details. During their captivity, the hostages were said to start to sympathize with Janne. In the middle of hostage negotiations, one of the captives told Olof Palme, the prime minister back then, that she was very disappointed with him. She felt that she was completely safe with Janne, but she was terrified of what would happen if the police were to storm the bank. She apparently feared the police more than she feared her kidnapper. Basically, as the theory went, she had developed trust with Janne during the captivity, and she even felt thankful to him when he let her move around inside the bank. Janne Olsson kept a noose around her neck so she would be strangled if the police tried to sedate him, but she still expressed more trust towards him than the police. The psychiatrist assisting the police wanted to call this the Norrmalmstorg Syndrome. Norrmalmstorg is this place, the Norrmalm Square. But no one outside of Sweden knows where this is, so the syndrome was rebranded as the Stockholm Syndrome by foreign newspapers. So that's a neat little wrap-up, isn't it? This is where the Stockholm Syndrome started, and it's a clear example of how the syndrome works. Well, not quite. In interviews with the victims from the 1973 kidnapping here, they have pointed out that they absolutely did not sympathize with Janne Olsson or his motives. They only thought that the police acted recklessly, jeopardizing their lives. And Hugh McGowan from the New York Police Department spent 35 years in various hostage negotiations, and he claims that he has barely seen any case of the Stockholm Syndrome. He argues that psychologists often look for cause and effect where there might not actually be one, and the syndrome itself might not even exist. Jess Hill is an author who published a book called See What You Made Me Do in 2020, and in it she argues that the Stockholm Syndrome is highly questionable. Essentially, the diagnoses are often made by the media and not by professionals in psychology. In the end, the Stockholm Syndrome is a pretty questionable condition. The logic behind it sounds reasonable in layman's terms, but there just might not be enough evidence that it's a real psychological condition in hostage situations. There's a lot more to dig into, though. There are similarities between the Stockholm Syndrome and domestic abuse, for example, and it's been shown that kidnappers also start to sympathize with their victims. So there is something going on in these cases between dependents and abusers. But calling everything Stockholm Syndrome is just lazy, and it disregards the unique qualities of every situation. So the next time you see Stockholm Syndrome mentioned in the news, you just might want to have a think if it's actually the case, or if it's a lazy slapped-on media label. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this little look at how it all started. It's not the thing about Stockholm that I'm most proud about, but it's quite interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day.